In 1911, a Sicilian family in Newark was earning $14 a week laying railroad track, paying $11 a month in rent, and feeding 9 people in 3 rooms. And by every calculation American social workers could devise, they should have spent the next 30 years exactly where they were. They owned a building by 1916. Not a room, not a lease, not a promise of something better. A building. And the social workers who had been tracking this family, documenting their poverty, writing reports about their hopeless prospects, had absolutely no explanation for how it happened. What they didn't understand is that these families had arrived from an island where the government had been robbing them for 500 years, where every landlord was an enemy and every bank was a trap, and where the only financial system that had ever actually worked was the one they built themselves from blood and silence. They brought that system to America. They refined it in the tenements of New York and Newark and South Philadelphia, and they used it to outbuy, outsave, and outmaneuver every immigrant group around them, all while American institutions were convinced they were too poor, too uneducated, and too foreign to ever own anything. 10 practices. Some of them were off the books. Some of them were technically illegal. All of them worked. Hit subscribe. We're going through every single one. Number 10, the tontine savings system nobody wrote down. In 1924, a Russell Sage Foundation researcher named Louise Odenkrantz spent 6 months in the Sicilian blocks of East Harlem trying to understand how these families were accumulating capital. She interviewed 200 households. She found a savings mechanism she couldn't categorize in any existing financial framework. 12 to 15 families, always from the same village in Sicily, always connected by blood or godparent ties, pooled a fixed weekly contribution into a common fund held by the oldest woman in the group. Not a bank, not a formal institution. A woman, usually a grandmother, usually illiterate in English and sometimes in Italian, who kept the ledger in her head and was considered incorruptible by everyone who knew her. Every week, one family received the entire pot. The rotation continued until every family had received once. Then it started again. The weekly contribution was typically $2 to $4 per family. With 15 families contributing $3 each, the weekly pot was $45. In a year, each family received $45 once, roughly 3 months' rent or the deposit on a small property. Odenkrantz calculated that a family participating for 5 years could accumulate enough for a down payment on a 2-family house. The Sicilians called it the tontine, though the word meant something different in formal finance. American banks called it illegal when they noticed it because it operated without licensing. Nobody stopped it. The oldest woman kept her ledger in her head, and nobody ever reported her cheating. Number 9, the double family house strategy. Concetta Vitale arrived from Palermo in 1903 with her husband Salvatore and 4 children. They settled in the Chambersburg section of Trenton, New Jersey, in a neighborhood that was already half Sicilian. Salvatore got work in a rubber factory at $16 a week. By 1908, they had enough saved through the tontine and 5 years of Concetta taking in boarders to buy a 2-family house on Butler Street for $1,400. They didn't move into the nicer apartment. They moved into the basement. The ground floor unit rented for $9 a month. The upper floor rented for $10 a month. Concetta, Salvatore, and their 4 children lived in 2 basement rooms that cost them nothing in rent. The $19 monthly rental income covered the mortgage payment of $14 and left $5 for building maintenance. By 1913, the mortgage was refinanced. By 1918, it was paid. By 1921, they'd used the equity to buy a second building 2 streets over. Salvatore died in 1929. Concetta owned 3 properties. Her children fought over the inheritance for 11 years. This pattern, buy a two-family, live in the worst unit, use rental income to pay the mortgage, was documented in a 1920 survey of Italian home ownership in New Jersey. Of 340 Italian-owned two-family properties surveyed, 287 had the owner living in the least desirable unit. The strategy was so consistent it appeared to be taught, passed deliberately from family to family. It probably was. Number 8, invisible income and the Board of Health problem. In 1912, the Manhattan Tenement House Department conducted inspections across the Lower East Side and East Harlem. They found a significant discrepancy between the number of people reported living in Sicilian apartments and the number who appeared to actually be sleeping there. The official records showed 4 residents in a unit. The inspectors counted beds for 9. The extra 5 were boarders, paying boarders, unregistered, unreported, off the books in every sense. A Sicilian family with a 3-room apartment could take in 3 boarders at $2.50 per month each. That was $7.50 a month, more than half the rent generated from existing space. The boarders were always Pisani, men from the same Sicilian village recently arrived, saving money before sending for their own families. They slept on shifts. Men working day labor slept at night. Men working night shifts slept during the day. The beds were never empty. The Board of Health called it a sanitation crisis. The Sicilians called it subsidized housing. A 1913 health report complained that Italian families were impossible to regulate because their living arrangements were constantly in flux and deliberately obscured from authorities. Maria Ciancetti on 115th Street in Manhattan ran a boarding operation from 1906 to 1919 that, by her daughter's later account, never had fewer than 4 paying boarders and sometimes had 8. The income went directly into a savings tin in the kitchen. In 1919, she had $840 in the tin. She used it as a down payment on a house in the Bronx. The health department never got a cent. Number 7, the fig tree economy. This one sounds minor. It wasn't. Sicilian immigrants had been cultivating fig trees for 2,000 years. They knew exactly what the trees needed, how to protect them through northeastern winters, how to coax fruit from a climate that had no business producing figs. When they arrived in Newark and Brooklyn and South Philadelphia, they brought fig tree cuttings hidden in their luggage. Customs officials occasionally confiscated them, more often didn't notice, and planted them in any soil they could access. Backyards, narrow side passages between buildings, vacant lots that nobody had bothered to fence. A mature fig tree in a New Jersey backyard produced 40 to 60 pounds of fruit per year. Fresh figs sold for 8 to 12 cents per pound at the Washington Market in Manhattan in the early 1920s. Dried figs, which Sicilian women produced at home by threading figs on string and hanging them to dry in the sun, sold for hire. A family with 3 mature trees could generate $15 to $25 in cash sales per year from the fruit alone, plus reduce their own food costs significantly. Giuseppe Schibetta in Newark planted his first fig tree in 1904, the year he arrived from Agrigento. By 1912, he had 11 trees in 3 different backyards, all tended by himself and his sons. By 1919, he was selling figs to 3 grocers and supplying fruit for the feast day tables of 2 churches. His son Mario, interviewed in 1978, said the fig trees paid for the down payment on the family house. "Nobody counted that money," Mario said. "The government didn't know about it. My father kept it separate." Number 6, the vendetta against interest. Sicilians had a specific cultural trauma around debt. Centuries of absentee landlords, usurious lending from the landed gentry, and a feudal system that kept peasant families in permanent obligation had produced a visceral, almost physical revulsion toward paying interest to anyone. Sicilian immigrants in America transferred this revulsion onto American financial institutions with an intensity that confused their neighbors and impressed urban economists. A 1931 study by Columbia sociologist Robert Lind examined savings patterns across immigrant groups in New York City. He found that Sicilian families had the lowest rate of consumer credit usage of any group studied, including groups with higher incomes. They did not buy furniture on installment. They did not take store credit. If they couldn't pay cash, they didn't buy. This wasn't poverty, it was strategy. The same families who refused a $40 furniture installment plan were saving $200 a year in a tin in the kitchen. They'd rather sit on wooden crates for 3 years than pay a furniture store $5 in interest. Angelo Ferrara in South Philadelphia told his children, according to his granddaughter Rosa interviewed in 2003, that interest was a tax paid by people who didn't understand what money was for. Angelo arrived in 1907. He owned his home by 1913. He never paid interest on anything in his life. His granddaughter thought this was extreme. She carried 3 credit cards. She did not own property. Number 5. The Corredo conversion. The Corredo was the traditional Sicilian dowry, not money, but goods. Linens, embroidered tablecloths, handmade lace, cooking equipment, preserved foods, sometimes furniture. A Sicilian girl was expected to spend years accumulating her Corredo before marriage, and the quality and quantity of it was a direct signal of her family's status and seriousness. In Sicily, the Corredo had no cash value. In America, it had 2. Sicilian immigrant mothers who had brought their Corredo with them, or who had accumulated goods in America, discovered that other immigrant families, not just Sicilian, but Italian broadly, and sometimes Jewish and Polish neighbors, would pay cash for high-quality handmade linens. The embroidery work that Sicilian women had done since adolescence, the kind that took months per piece, commanded prices from $3 to $15 per item at the turn-of-the-century dry goods markets. A woman who had 20 pieces of embroidered linen in her Corredo chest had between $60 and $300 in portable hidden assets. She could sell them when cash was needed without her husband knowing, without the tax authorities knowing, without the landlord being able to garnish them. Rosaria Bongiorno in Brooklyn sold 17 pieces of her Corredo between 1908 and 1913, generating $180 in cash that she added to the household savings without ever telling her husband Carmelo the source. When they bought their house in 1914, Carmelo thought he'd saved it all himself. Rosaria let him think so. The house was put in both their names. She had read the deed before she signed it. Number 4, the midwife network as financial institution. This is the one that sounds the most unlikely. Stay with it. The Camar, the midwife and godmother figure who occupied a central role in Sicilian village life, arrived in America and set up practice in the tenements within months of each immigrant community establishing itself. She delivered babies, prepared the dead, advised on illness, mediated family disputes, and arranged marriages. She also, in many cases, functioned as the community's first financial intermediary. The Camara knew who had money. She knew who needed money. She knew whose husband drank and whose husband saved. She knew which families were preparing to buy property and which were struggling. This made her the natural broker for informal loans between families. A family with $200 saved and a family that needed $200 for a property down payment would not find each other through a bank. Banks didn't lend to Sicilians in many neighborhoods until the 1920s, and even then with hostility and excessive interest. But the Camara knew of both families. She arranged the loan. She set the terms, typically no interest, with repayment over 2 years, and an obligation of reciprocal labor or goods that she specified. She witnessed the agreement and served as its enforcer. Nunziata Catalano operated as Kamar in the Sicilian blocks of Federal Hill in Providence, Rhode Island, from 1904 until her death in 1938. A 1935 social work survey of the neighborhood found that she had brokered at least 40 property loans in 30 years, moving an estimated $18,000 through the community without a single formal document. Not one borrower ever defaulted. Defaulting on the Kamar, her grandson explained in 1982, was not a financial problem. It was something much worse. Number 3. The abandoned property gambit. In the years after 1905, as Sicilian communities established themselves in industrial cities, a specific pattern of property acquisition emerged that municipal tax authorities noticed, documented with frustration, but couldn't fully prevent. A property fell into tax delinquency, typically a building owned by an absentee landlord, or a vacant lot in a neighborhood that wealthier investors had written off. The back taxes might be $40 or $80. The property itself might be appraised at $600. Sicilian families in the neighborhood knew about these properties because they walked past them every day. They knew the owners because the owners sometimes came to collect rent from neighboring buildings. They knew the tax situation because somebody in the community, often a barber or a notary, someone who could navigate English language bureaucracy, had learned to read the tax delinquency rolls at the county courthouse. The acquisition method was simple: pay the back taxes. In many jurisdictions, paying the tax delinquency of an abandoned property gave the payer a legal claim. The original owner could redeem the property by reimbursing the taxes plus interest within a redemption period, typically 2 years. Most didn't bother. Salvatore Greco in South Philadelphia acquired 4 properties this way between 1918 and 1927, paying out a total of $290 in back taxes for properties subsequently assessed at $3,800 combined. He knew which properties to target because his brother-in-law, a barber on Ellsworth Street, had cultivated a friendship with a clerk in the city treasurer's office who let him look at the delinquency ledgers. The clerk received a monthly haircut, free of charge, for 11 years. Number 2. The 3-generation income stack. The American social worker looked at a Sicilian household and counted residents. The Sicilian family looked at the same household and counted income streams. The structure was almost always the same. The grandfather, if he was present and physically able, worked whatever job his age allowed: light manufacturing, vegetable selling, building maintenance. He earned $6 to $9 a week. He turned over $5 to the household fund and kept $1 to $4 for his personal expenses, which were minimal. The grandmother managed the household, took in laundry or piecework, tended the garden, managed the boarders. Her income was $2 to $6 a week, entirely off the books, entirely into the household fund. The father worked the primary job: construction, factory, railroad, docks. $14 to $22 a week. He turned over $12 to $18. He kept $2 to $4. The mother managed everything else, including the sale of home-produced goods: eggs from rooftop chickens, preserved vegetables, sewing and alterations for neighbors. Another $3 to $7 a week into the fund. The children, as soon as they were old enough, contributed. A 10-year-old selling newspapers earned $1.50 a week. A 12-year-old doing delivery work earned $3. That money went to the fund. A 1918 survey of Sicilian household incomes in East Harlem, conducted by the Settlement House on 116th Street, found that the average Sicilian household had 3.2 income earners. The average Irish household in the same buildings had 1.6. The Italian household earned less per worker. The household earned significantly more in total. By 1921, the combined savings of the Marchese family in Newark, 3 generations, 8 income earners, 18 months of systematic stacking, was $740. They bought a house on Garside Street. The grandfather, Giuseppe, was 71 years old. He had arrived in 1904 with $18. He carried the payment to the title company himself. Number 1. The intentional return that never happened. This is the one that explains everything else, and it's built on a misunderstanding that turned out to be useful. Most Sicilian immigrants who arrived between 1900 and 1920 didn't plan to stay. This is documented in their letters, in the records of the Italian consulate, in interviews conducted by social workers who tried to understand why they seemed so indifferent to American civic life and so obsessed with accumulating cash. They were going back. They were going to return to Sicily with American money and buy land in their village and live as men of property in a way their fathers had never been able to. The return rate for Sicilian immigrants was among the highest of any group. Roughly 30 to 40% did actually return, at least temporarily, in the 1900 to 1920 period. But the ones who stayed, and most eventually stayed, had spent 5 to 8 years living as if they were leaving, which meant they had spent 5 to 8 years consuming at the absolute minimum, saving at the absolute maximum, treating every purchase as a cost to be eliminated, every dollar saved as a dollar closer to the ship ticket home. When they finally accepted, sometime in the late 1910s or 1920s, that they were not going back because the children were American now, because Italy had become a place they no longer entirely recognized, because the war had changed everything, they had 5 to 8 years of accumulated savings sitting in a tin or in the Camar's care or in the Tontine Fund. They had been saving to buy Sicilian land. They bought American property instead. A 1923 study by the Italian Welfare League found that Sicilian immigrant families who had been in America for 8 or more years owned property at a rate of 41%. The national homeownership rate that year was 46%. But that national number included families who had been in America for generations, who had inherited property, who had started with advantages these families had never seen. The Sicilians had started with nothing. They owned almost as much. Rosario Ventimiglia arrived in Brooklyn in 1901 from a village outside Messina. He planned to stay 3 years, save $300, return and buy a piece of his uncle's farm. He stayed 38 years. He owned 2 buildings on DeKalb Avenue when he died in 1939. His daughter, Elena, born in Brooklyn in 1907 and therefore never Sicilian in the way her father was, told an interviewer in 1974 that her father had spent the last 20 years of his life being grateful he'd never gone back. He used to say Sicily made him who he was, she said, but America made him what he became. He couldn't explain the difference. Neither can I. The tin where he kept his savings, a battered olive oil can he'd brought from Messina, was on the mantel in Elena's house in Queens until she died in 1991. It still had $4 in it. She never touched it. She didn't know why.